welcome to the Bible Feed podcast. I'm Dan Weatherall, and today we are going to continue a bit of a series that we've been doing. Last episode, we were continuing our discovery of what the terms the devil and Satan mean, and we're going to continue that today, and I've got Paul here with me again. It's almost a bit of a tangent, actually, but it's a topic that always is related to the devil and Satan. It's the question of demons. So whenever you talk about the devil and Satan and try and work out what that is in the Bible, invariably at some point the question of demons will come up. And so we need to step to one side and consider that in this episode. So most Christian sources, most non-Christian sources even, would describe demons as some sort of malevolent supernatural being. So they are things that can cause harm to humans. They can possess you. We can have demon-possessed people and things like that. So that kind of cuts across what we've been looking at so far. We've been considering the Bible's presentation or use of those terms, devil and Satan, and seen that it isn't really presenting anything like a supernatural being. Instead, it's personifying that human tendency to sin, and really that's the fundamental meaning behind it. So now we're going to consider demons, and the sort of general view or general definition of what they are seems to cut across that completely, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's a tension in the two ideas. You know, we've already seen that fundamentally the Bible as it presents God is projecting a monotheistic view of things, that there is one God, there is no God like him, there is no other God beside him, and those kind of phrases occur repeatedly. And it's really hard to get your head around what you might call a demonology, you know, a theology that includes a world, a universe that is populated by these malevolent beings called demons, because that fits much more into the dualistic type of worldview that we consider, with evil spiritual beings causing bad things and good spiritual beings kind of resisting or fighting against that. And there's two heads of these two kind of competing armies or forces or whatever. There's God and there's the prince of demons. So you almost inevitably, if you're thinking about demons as this population of supernatural beings, you're almost forced into a position of creating a prince of demons that is the opposite, the equal and opposite to God in some way. And the last two episodes that we've done on this, thinking about the terms devil and Satan, have really illustrated that that's not what the Bible is presenting the devil and Satan as. It's presenting there's one God, and it's using the device of personification to portray the significant problem that is human sin, you know, and linked to that mortality and everything that goes with the mortal condition, illness and so on. And even, as we saw in the last episode, to the sort of power structures that humans build that manifest human desires and sinful desires. And they're linked to the terms devil and Satan. So from a scriptural point of view, there isn't really support for a personal top demon or devil or anti-God supernatural being. You know, by looking at the scriptures we have so far, we've sort of beheaded the evil side of what would be a dualistic view. And we've seen only things consistent really with monotheism, a monotheistic worldview.
Okay. But the thing remains, though, is that in the Bible, the word demons, you know, that does come up, doesn't it? And quite a few times, quite a few locations, really. So we need to work out what that really is. Maybe there's no leader, maybe there's no supernatural devil, but there are these spiritual beings. Maybe they exist anyway, you know, without that leader, without that head. So we need to work out how we do this. You know, should we be afraid of demons? I think that's one question in one of the episodes. We by denying that there is a supernatural devil, are we almost tempting fate and allowing him to come and get us? And should we be worried about what they can do to us? You know, is there spiritual warfare involved in them? All those sorts of questions. How do we ward them off? How do we fight them, if they're indeed a thing? So how are we going to start and tackle this?
Yeah, and very much like the word devil, which we saw only appears in the New Testament, demon is similar. It almost entirely is a New Testament word. And therefore, we'll be looking at a Greek word, and it's the Greek word daimonia, There's also some phrases like unclean spirits or evil spirits that we read about, again, particularly in the New Testament. It's perhaps worth just pointing out that if you're reading the King James Version, in the New Testament, you'll come across a word that in the English appears as devils, so plural of devil. It's not a word that's related to the word for devil that we saw, which was diabolos. So when you read devils in King James Version, that's this word that is usually translated now demons, demonia. And there's a real concentration of the use of the word demon in the Gospels, in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But what is really important and helpful for us to do, as considering this as a biblical theme overall, is to get a view of what the whole scripture perspective is on demons. So it's actually helpful to start by looking at references that are not in the Gospels.
Okay, so let's do that. And you said it's almost entirely a New Testament word, which means that there's something in the Old Testament. Am I right? Shall we start there?
It does. Yeah, there's not much in the Old Testament, but there are two that I think are really helpful to look at because they set the tone for how we should think about this concept, this word, when we get to the New Testament. So, first of all, a little bit about the words that appear in the Old Testament, which is primarily written in Hebrew. The original language is Hebrew. So there's two words. There's se'irim, which is basically a word which means hairy, and is sometimes used of wild goats that inhabit the desert and wild places, deserted ruins and those kind of places. And in our English Bibles, they're sometimes, particularly the ESV, RSV, they're translated as goat demons.
Okay.
So you'll see demons there in our English Bible, but actually the Hebrew word underneath it is a word that just means a hairy wild thing. So it's not necessarily a supernatural being at all. No. It's just that. So let's leave that aside. And the other word that appears is sedim, which is a word that means a sort of a force or vitality, a spirit of some sort. But interestingly, it can be used in both good and bad senses. So it's not like the English word demon. It's not an equivalent to that, which is pretty much just associated with bad stuff. Okay,
so let's not look at that hairy wild thing. We don't need to look at anymore at se'irim. If I've said that right, which I don't think I have. But
we're equally poor.
That's in our right. Okay, good. Maybe I am right. Let's look at this sedim. Where does that appear?
Yeah, okay. There's two places that we should look at. The first is in Deuteronomy chapter 32, which is actually an interesting chapter around this whole subject, and which we will come back to, I think, in the next episode. So Deuteronomy 32, if we have a look at a few verses, verse 15 to 18.
So Deuteronomy 32, verse 15. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him, and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. You were unmindful of the rock that bore you, and you forgot the God who gave you birth.
Okay, thanks for that. So this is all about Israel. So it starts off, verse 15, but Jeshurun, that's a name that is applied to Israel, the people of Israel. And it's all about their unfaithfulness to the one God, Yahweh, and them worshipping other gods and sacrificing to other gods, and the idols and gods of the peoples around them. And there in verse 17, it says they sacrificed to demons that were no gods. So these gods of the peoples around them, these idols, are equated with these demons. But it makes a little comment there that were no gods. They're not God. They don't exist in the way that God exists. Yeah. And in fact, as we get towards the end of this chapter in verse 37, the argument continues. Then God will say, where are their gods? The rock in which they took refuge, who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offering. Let them rise up and help you. Let them be your protection. See now that I, even I, am he, and there is no God beside me. I kill and make alive, I wound and heal. There is none that can deliver out of my hand. So Yahweh, God, the God of Israel, is the only God, according to that. There are these idols that the peoples around you worship, but they're not gods. They can't protect you. They're not what the people that worship them think they are. They have no power. They can't protect them. They can't do anything. And so in ancient Israel, the word demon in that context is associated with the gods of the peoples around them.
Yeah, okay. So it's equating them with idols. Idolatry comes up so much, doesn't it, in the Old Testament? And the gods represented by the idols are these demons, and the emphasis seems to be that these don't exist, or they're not gods, they don't have any power, that they're absolutely powerless. Okay, what other references are there in the Old Testament?
So the other, and I think it's the only other use of this word sedim in the Old Testament, is in the Psalms, and it's in Psalm 106, so verse 34. So Psalm 106, verse 34, they did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them. So I think the context of this is them going into the land, and they didn't remove the peoples that were there. So Israel did not destroy the peoples as the Lord commanded them, but they mixed with the nations and learned to do as they did. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters. So again, it's in the context of Israel's unfaithfulness to Yahweh and learning to do what the nations and the peoples around them did, and worshipping their gods, and demons, god, idols of those people are again kind of treated as equivalent terms.
Yeah. So in this psalm, in this reference here, it doesn't really say anything about their existence or their nature. It just almost assumes what they are, really, doesn't it? Is there any way we can work out what the writer of the psalm thought?
Yeah, I mean, that passage in Deuteronomy was quite explicit.
Yeah.
These are not gods. But if we're drawing this link between demons and the idols of the peoples around them, there are a whole load more references in the Old Testament and in the Psalms, and we can look at a couple, that refer to idols and what the authors of the Old Testament's view was of those idols. So just going back a few Psalms to Psalm 96, where we read in verse 5 of Psalm 96, "For all the gods of the peoples are worthless idols, but the Lord made the heavens." So they're worthless. And, they're talked about as just objects of silver and gold, the work of human hands. Maybe Isaiah 44 is worth a quick look. Verse 13 through to 15 talks about a carpenter who takes a piece of wood and shapes it into the figure of a man. He cuts down Caesars, he chooses a cypress or an oak, and then it becomes fuel for a man, and he takes part of it and burns it to warm himself, and then he takes another part of it and carves it into a figure and worships it. And it's mockery, really, for why people worshipping these things that are just objects and they have no power, and people are putting trust in them. And there's quite a lot of ridicule of the idea of worshipping these things, because the implication is they can't do anything. They can't walk, they can't talk, they can't protect you, as that passage in Deuteronomy said. But in some ways, and we saw a little bit of that in those Psalms and in Deuteronomy, because people believe in them, the way the writers of the Old Testament talk about them, they talk about them as though they exist, as though they have feelings. They will be humiliated, they will tremble, they will be put to shame. Well, they don't have any real existence, so how can they have those feelings? But it's an important idea to get our heads around, because it's helpful when we come to the New Testament, that even though it makes it clear that these things have no power, they're ridiculed as just objects of wood or stone or, silver and gold. And yet, because they have a hold over people and people are putting their trust in them, they're also talked about as though they exist, as though they have those feelings, as a way of demonstrating that they do have their power.
No, that's really interesting, and it makes me think of Elijah on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal, when he cries, calls to them, cry, why don't you shout louder, cry louder? Perhaps he's sleeping, perhaps he's gone on a long journey, and
or relieving
yes,
himself.
That's right. So it's a way, it's a device, isn't it, of demonstrating that they're not real, and it's like this mockery in Isaiah of the idol. Of course, the worshippers of the idol didn't think the bit of wood was the god, did they? They weren't that stupid, as it were. They thought that it was representing a god or some spiritual being that they're trying to worship. But by putting it in this rhetorical device like this, it's showing that all they are doing is worshipping a piece of wood, because there is no real power behind. So, yeah, that's really helpful, actually. So those two examples of demons then in the Old Testament basically connect it to the gods of the nations and to idolatry, to idol worship, and it sort of de-emphasizes any kind of literal existence and really elevates the fact that they're insignificant, they are worthless, they are powerless, there's irrelevance basically to them. If you believe in Yahweh, you can ignore these things because they have no power. So, is there any sense in which these demons in the Old Testament exist?
Just in the sense that we've alluded to in what we've just said, there is a sort of virtual existence, but it's only in the minds or the imagination of those that think they exist. And because they think they exist, in that sense, they have power over people. You know, people in those times were doing things in their lives, doing things in a particular way because of the power that they thought was in these gods. So they exist in that sort of virtual sense. And certainly that included some in Israel. They thought they existed. And that's why some of these prophets are so emphatic in their ridicule, because they're not just making an argument to be heard by the peoples around them. They're making an argument to be heard by people in Israel who are putting their trust in these other gods and are allowing them in their minds to have some power over them. And, you know, there's a couple of quotes from some scholars in a couple of Bible dictionaries, and I've chosen a couple here which are deliberately non-denominational. Okay. So the first of them is the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. I know we haven't got to the Gospels yet, but it's giving the background to what we'll look at in the Gospels. So the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels, which is InterVarsity Press. And it says there that Israel's confidence in the sovereignty of Yahweh was not conducive to the development of a consistent demonology. Okay. So that's kind of obvious as where we started. If you think that there's one God, Yahweh is sovereign, then you're unlikely to develop the idea of demons as spiritual beings being a threat. And the other source that I'll quote from here is the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, which is from the Yale University Press. It says there, caution against using the scattered and limited references in the Old Testament as evidence for a widespread belief in demons. Most interpreters argue for a position that references both to demons themselves and to the practices associated with them seem to argue for some belief in demons at certain levels of Israelite society at certain times. So it's there. Yeah. You know, there are some people in Israel who are thinking that these gods are real and they have some power over them. But the Old Testament and the Old Testament prophet perspective is they don't exist. They don't have power. The only power they have is what you allow them to have over you in your mind or your imagination. Yeah.
And where it did exist, it wasn't consistent because it's limited by this strict monotheism. So, okay. So that's helpful. And I feel like that is going to be helpful as we work our way forward. But before we get out of the Old Testament, there's something else in the Old Testament that I'm thinking of. I don't think it uses a word that's ever translated demons, but it talks about an evil spirit, and I'm thinking of King Saul, where it says about an evil spirit from God, from Yahweh. An evil spirit from God came to him, and then David had to go and play his harp to try and calm him down. Yeah. Often demon and evil spirits are sort of put together in the same category. Are we talking about something similar?
Well, I mean, the first thing to notice about that incident is that it is explicitly, it's something from God. It's something that God has caused to happen. The mental state of Saul was affected either directly or indirectly, and it says it's from God. It doesn't say it's from anything else or anywhere else. And so that's consistent with the only power that is from God. It doesn't reference it in a way that sounds like it's a personal being or anything like that. And when you look at commentaries around that incident, it's most often interpreted as a as Saul descending into some sort of state of deep depression.
Okay.
Some suggested he was bipolar and that kind of thing.
Okay, I feel like there's something in the word spirit that is often assumed that perhaps isn't there. And I think way back in the archives, we've got one episode on the spirit, which might possibly be helpful. So we'll sort of park that to one side. So let's look at the New Testament then. Are we going to turn to the Gospels next?
Well, we're nearly going to
All
get
right.
to the Gospels, because there are a couple of references. As I say, we want to look at the references outside the Gospels before we get there. And there's a couple of references in the letters of Paul to demons. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 is the first one that we want to look at. And this is in a section where Paul is encouraging the early believers to essentially dedicate themselves to God and to Jesus and to worship of them, and not to participate in activities associated with, sacrifices made to the Roman gods or Greek gods of the time. So in 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 18, it says, "Consider the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices participants in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice, they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he?" So again, in the context, it's eating food or taking food that has been offered to idols. So it's linking idol and demon there in the same passage again. It's also saying the same as what we saw in Deuteronomy. They are not anything. Am I saying that idols are anything? It says, no, I'm not saying that. All I'm saying is that the people that are offering to them think they are something. And so what I don't want you to do is participate with them because they think they're offering to something that has power. So it's a very similar message to what we saw in the Old Testament. An idol has no real existence. A demon is used in an interchangeable way in chapter 10, has no real existence. But because some people think they do exist, I don't want you to go eating that food offered to idols or to participate with that.
That's interesting. That passage in 1 Corinthians 10, it says specifically the idol is nothing. Whether is an idol anything? No, but pagan sacrifice they offer to demons. So, you could be forgiven, perhaps. I'm just playing devil's advocate here, to excuse the pun, that some people might say, well, the idol is nothing, but actually they are sacrificing to demons, so do not do this. But then I think reading on, it's exactly what you're saying, isn't it? Then he goes on to explain practically what this means. And he means, verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner, eat whatever is set before you without raising any questions. But if someone says, this has been offered in sacrifice, don't eat it for the sake of the one who informed you, so for his conscience. So it's to do with how you present yourself to them, because they will have that belief and they'll think, this Christianity can go and participate in multi-god worship.
That's a good point.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, and it's really similar to Deuteronomy 32, isn't it? And there's something elsewhere, I think, in the letter to Timothy, and in 1 Timothy 4, that there's this other passage that uses demons. So 1 Timothy 4 verse 1, just read this. Now the Spirit expressly says that in later times some will depart from the faith by devoting themselves to deceitful spirits and teachings of demons. So there's something else there.
And that's an interesting one. Given what we've seen from the rest of Scripture so far on demons and idols and their non-existence, other than in a sort of virtual sense in people's imagination, there's here a prediction that some within the Christian community would depart from the faith and devote themselves to doctrines of demons or doctrines about demons, and maybe be encouraging believers to be engaged in some form of worship of not just God and Jesus, but other things, whatever that may be. And so it's interesting that here in the first century, that statement is made, and there may be people today who are very much placing a great deal of emphasis on concern about being afraid of fighting demons And if somebody's theology is placing a heavy emphasis on the existence of such beings that we have to be afraid of and ward them off in some way, then it's likely, according to this, that they've departed from the faith. They've got something out of kilter in their theology.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, okay. So there's probably a couple more other references in the New Testament, but I think we really need to get to the Gospels. So taking a step back, we've looked in the Old Testament and seen that really the emphasis there is that the demons and their connection with the idols and the gods of the nations are that they're really powerless. They do nothing. They don't exist, and there's nothing to be afraid of because we worship Yahweh. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing in Corinthians, and then that warning in Timothy about really, chasing after doctrines of demons. And so that seems all straightforward. It kind of fits with what we've come to look at and understand the devil and Satan. It's de-emphasizing any kind of spiritual being or spiritual beings that are associated with these words. But what on earth do we do with the Gospels then? Because we get to the Gospels, which we've avoided so far and we've got to deal with, and we find Jesus performing miracles. He does healing, he makes food, he does all this, and he casts out demons. That's the way it's described. So just for example, Matthew chapter 4, verse 24, his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them, and great crowds followed him. So we read that, and if we hadn't done any of the work we've done so far, it's plain on the page, isn't it? Surely that, how do we understand Jesus and dealing with demons?
Yeah, and I don't want it to sound too much as though we're fighting shy of dealing with what's here in the Gospels, because these are the accounts of the life of Jesus. Yeah. They're pretty important to us. And I think when we get our heads around perhaps what's going on here, we can fully embrace, we don't need to be afraid of what's here or uncertain about what's meant. When we look at the Gospels, we've got the three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the word demons, as in the example that you read out from Matthew, is used in the context of miracles of healing, and particularly examples which sound like things like epilepsy or schizophrenia or something like that. So there's another example in Mark chapter 5, where the one that was called Legion was cured of whatever was afflicting him, and whatever it was went into this herd of pigs, and they went careering off a cliff. And after that event, people in the town surrounding came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. So in his right mind, there's something to do with his mind, his mental state. And even in that one that you quoted from Matthew, those that are afflicted with diseases and pains, those that are oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics. And so there's a different class of illness or affliction in those oppressed by demons. So that appears in the Synoptic Gospels. So when John records miracles, he doesn't say anything about demons being the source of the problem. So given everything that we've seen so far, with devil and Satan not being personal beings, demons, when they're referred to in the Old Testament and in other parts of the New Testament outside the Gospels, not being anything, not being attributed any existence. One way to understand the appearance of demons in the Gospels is that these illnesses that are cured are illnesses that people didn't understand and are therefore attributed to a hidden force or a spirit being or demon in this way. So that's one way of understanding it.
Yeah, okay. So it's using language of the time, ways that people would have understood. Jesus is engaging with people who had this cultural background. And just remembering where Jesus is accused of casting out demons by the prince of demons, I think is the reference to Beelzebul, isn't there? So surely that's partly acknowledging their existence. Surely there is some level of belief that people had, because this is so widespread in the Gospels. But that's an interesting thing as well, isn't it? That we haven't seen it particularly in the Old Testament at all, and there's no sort of exorcisms or casting out of demons in the Old Testament, and suddenly we have this here in the Gospels, and then a little bit in the Acts as well, don't we? Yeah. Does that mean people were now believing in this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that is a feature of this, and why it suddenly appears in the Gospels. It suddenly seems to spring out of nowhere, because it's just not there in the Old Testament. There's several hundred years between the last part of the Old Testament and the Gospels. So there's quite a lot that's happened to the people of Israel in their land in that period, one of which is a period of Persian occupation. And it does seem as though, and scholars and commentators on it acknowledge, that an increase in the belief in evil spirits, demons and things of that nature develop under Persian influence in the Jewish mindset, if you like. So just a couple of quotations on that first of all, from a book by Giza Vermes, and he wrote a book called Jesus the Jew, which is really about the Jewish context of Jesus and understanding him in that context. So he writes, in the world of Jesus, the devil was believed to be the basis of sickness as well as sin. So we saw that in the last episode. The idea that demons were responsible for all moral and physical evil had penetrated deeply into the Jewish religious thought in the period following the Babylonian exile, no doubt as a result of Iranian or Persian influence on Judaism in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, when Palestine, as well as the Jews from the Eastern diaspora, were subject to direct Persian rule. Okay. So that's where he suggests it comes from. And then the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary says that the reports of demonic activity and exorcism in the New Testament are subject to various considerations by different scholars. One interpretation views the phenomenon as a first-century understanding of what would be known today as a psychological problem. So what the ancients called demonization would be diagnosed as psychoses. Okay. And then he says representatives of this view include, and he lists the scholars, and then gives a couple of other views, including saying still others maintain that the concept of demons actually existing is not incompatible with a modern cosmology. So it gives the primary interpretation is that these phenomenon are a first century way of understanding what we would understand today as psychological illnesses, psychoses. Okay.
And the language or the categories for understanding that and describing it comes probably from influence, from sort of Persian influence. And that would explain why it's in the Gospels and not before. So that makes sense. But I mean, there's that nagging question, why does Jesus sort of act as if these things are really there? That seems a bit strange, doesn't it? You mentioned Legion, he sort of in talking to this character and does something with the pigs, puts the demons in the pigs, or something happens and they run down the mountainside. And so he's not arguing with people. He's not trying to tell them, these aren't demons. Why doesn't he just make it clear?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. And partly, if Jesus had gone into arguing that, Legion, you're not suffering from some evil spirit or some demon, how does that help him?
That's true. Yeah.
he's still got a big problem. So, and actually, the answer to this is really an extension of what we've seen in the Old Testament, where even though there's an acknowledgement that these idols, whatever they are, don't really exist, don't have any power, they're still talked about as though they do exist and they have feelings because of the power that they have over people in their imagination. And I think it is just an extension of that idea. Jesus is accommodating. He's communicating in a language that people understand. And he doesn't directly go into an argument about their existence or their non-existence. What he does is something that is much more powerful. He heals them and demonstrates that the power of God is able to resolve this problem, whatever it is. As part of persuading people to trust God and to trust him as God's representative, as God's son, he heals them. So whatever people think they are, and they may continue to think whatever they thought they were, but they come away knowing that God, the one God, and through Jesus, his son, has the power to overcome them. So they no longer need to fear their power. And that's a much more effective way of destroying the hold in people's imaginations that these things have over people, rather than going into an attempt to argue that they don't exist. Because I don't even know how he would have done that.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes me think of Elijah again, on the top of Mount Carmel, didn't explain to the prophets of Baal that, he's not actually going to respond because he doesn't exist. The way of demonstrating that was through his taunts of them, and then actually God showed and proved it by bringing the fire down. So yeah, that's useful. Okay, so I suppose the question then is, should we as Christians should we be attributing any existence in any sense to demons? That's the the bottom line.
Well, I think having started with what we saw in the Old Testament and in the other references in the New Testament, it's pretty clear that any move in a Christian belief set or theology towards believing in these kind of beings is pretty much prohibited by those references. In 1 Corinthians 10, they're not anything, and the departure from the faith that is likely to be associated with doctrines to do with demons. So I don't think we should be attributing or giving them any space in our theological system.
Okay.
Right.
It seems to me like there's two options, aren't there? We've built the framework around, without looking at the Gospels, we've built a framework from monotheism and the fact that they're attributed to the idols. They don't mean anything. They don't have power. We've looked at all of that. And then we come to the Gospels and we've got a choice. We either reinterpret what we've seen with the evidence from the Gospels and taking that literally, which I think would be really hard to do, actually, to take the Gospels accounts and then somehow change what all these other passages mean and that view of monotheistic religion. Or we do it the other way around, like we've said, and interpret what's going on in the Gospels as Jesus demonstrating God's power over whatever they think these things were. And I suppose if we're sort of getting to some sort of conclusion, then what would be the relevance today? There was that mention from that, was it Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, about the different understanding, and today we'd understand things like this as psychoses. So how do we as Christians deal with all this today and understand these things?
I mean, I think we can take the fundamental point from both Old Testament and New Testament, which is that demons as actual personal beings are not something that Christians should be concerned or afraid about. There's one God, there's only one power, and that's all we need. That's end of story, really. References to demons outside of the Gospels are clearly in the context of idols of other peoples around them that the scriptures say are not gods, they have no existence. References to demons in the context of healing, such as the Gospels, do reflect the first century culture that derived from Persian influence, that these kind of spirits caused illnesses that they couldn't explain. And today we would understand many of those as psychological or mental illnesses. And we can read the Gospels and understand them in that way. And certainly we should avoid imagining into existence, into a sort of virtual existence in our minds, beings and give them kind of hold or power or some kind of sway over us. But even today, people with certain faith backgrounds or growing up in different cultures around the world may still find it hard to accept that there are not evil spirits out there. And even if you find it hard, the main point is not their existence, really. The main point is the reality of the one God, and he is the only source of power, and be comforted by that, And if we trust that and his power, even to raise the dead, as he demonstrated with Jesus, then nothing can harm us. Nothing can remove us from the scope of that power and that love. And that just pushes anything else into irrelevance and ultimately non-existence, even in our imagination.
Okay, great. That's really a good place to end up. So we're left with a sort of situation where we're not constantly on the lookout, waging spiritual warfare against forces. We've not got this conflict theology. We're consistently in a monotheistic framework. And that's really, really helpful, I think. That was our tangent to sort of go off a little bit onto demons. But you mentioned Deuteronomy 32. We looked a little bit at that, and there's more we need to go down, I think. I'm mindful that we, in these 3 episodes now that we've done, that we haven't gone to the book of Job or really in detail looked at Satan in the book of Job. So we need to look at that, don't we?
Yeah.
The sons of God, and there's a whole thing about spiritual beings just generally, isn't there?
In the context of, sons of God, fallen angels.
So I think that's something else we need to just think through and give it a bit of space and work out what we think about that. But that's for another time. You'll be glad to know. So let's sign off here. Hopefully that's useful. Thank you very much, Paul, leading us through that. And as ever, head over to biblefeed.org and see what we're doing. And by all means, get in touch if you have any comments or questions.